So, I grew up in a little place called Medicine Bow, Wyoming. We're probably most famous for being the not-so-final resting place of Dippy the dinosaur, whose skeleton now resides in the Natural History Museum over in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, there's some hot springs just outside of town, and Butch Cassidy robbed a train just a couple of miles away on the first cross-country railroad. But aside from that, there's not much here aside from dust, gravel, trees, and some trailers. I was raised by a single mom, and while words like strict and rules didn't seem to be in her vocabulary, there was one thing she told me to never, ever do. And that was to never go near the house of old Bob Barnes. So Bob lived in a trailer right on the edge of town, and he made his living going through other people's trash to find stuff he could either sell or turn into something he could sell. And he only ever did it at night too, but even when people did catch him, half of them were too scared to even say anything on account of the fact that he actually killed someone and got away with it. Mom told me he was a monster, and that the kid that he'd killed had been a close friend of hers in high school. And that's all she ever told me about it though, and I figured it was just because it was too much hurt to talk about. Over the years, I learned bits and pieces here and there about Bob's life and the murder he was said to have gotten away with. I learned he fought in Vietnam, that he volunteered for it too, but that after he came home again, he just sort of couldn't go back to normal. He moved his trailer right out there near East Allen Lake, and people said never to go around to the north side at night because old Bob would most likely be out there shooting squirrels for the next night's dinner. "Don't want him mistaking you for a squirrel now, do we?" the older people would say, with that look in their eye that said that they were serious. But now everyone acted like they were scared of him, and some folks seemed to even sort of pity him. Now, I remember I was hanging out with a buddy of mine when we were both about 14, and his mom was giving us a ride someplace when he brought up old Bob. My buddy's talking about him like he's the boogeyman, but all his mom had to say about him was basically, poor man, all he wants is to be left alone. Now my buddy's like, "Mom, he killed someone." And you saw this weird switch in her like she was putting on a mask as she said, "That he did. And you better stay the heck away from his trailer, young man." And it was like we'd, I don't know, caught her out on something. I just wouldn't fully understand what that thing was until a few years later. And by the time I was 17, old Bob was definitely the devil to me. One night, my mom had gotten drunk and told me the story of how Bob killed her friend. She wasn't like an alcoholic or anything, she just liked to have a few wine coolers on a Friday night while watching Dallas and Falcon Crest. But that one night, I got home from a friend's place to find her all teary-eyed while looking at old pictures of herself and her high school friends, including the kid old Bob had apparently murdered. She told me how they used to hang out in school and sometimes outside of school too, since two mutual friends were dating. And she said aside from partying a little too much, he was a good guy and didn't deserve to die in such a way or at such a young age. He'd been drinking out near that lake with a couple of friends when he wandered off to take a leak in the bushes. And that's when he sees someone walking through the shrubs carrying what looked like a little kid over their shoulder. Mom's friend yelled something at the guy, who starts running off with this kid over their shoulder, so he and his buddies decide to give chase. And then once they caught up with the guy, and with Mom's friend at the lead, the guy drops the kid, spins around, and lights Mom's friend up like a bang, 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 bang. And the poor guy was dead before he hit the dirt. And while the kid they rescued was taken to the hospital, she ended up passing away because she had a massive dose of tranquilizers in her system, and it damaged her organs. All the kids that were hanging out at the lake that night said it was old Bob that shot Mom's friend, but then for some reason, he just was never arrested and never went to jail. And it finally made total sense to me why everyone either feared or hated him. Maybe my buddy's mom just didn't know the full story, and that's why she said that weird thing about that poor man. But I did, and as the months went by, all this hatred for him was festering away until finally, I decided I was going to do something about it. I had already told my friends about the whole thing, so they knew how much I hated old Bob for having saddled my mom with this lifelong trauma. But it wasn't until we were sitting around the campfire one night that I brought up the prospect of doing something. One of my buddies had asked his dad about this little kid who died from the OD, and he'd confirmed that that was true. People didn't like to talk about it, as you never knew when the girl's mom would show up behind you in a store or whatever, but the whole thing that differed from the story he heard was that the kid had shown up in town and hadn't been found near the lake. That little detail didn't matter to us, though. It didn't matter to me, anyway. The story was still basically the same, and old Bob still needed to pay for what he'd done all those years before. And so I hatched the plan with my buddies that night. I was going to hike out to his trailer in the middle of the night, watch it for a while to make sure no one was up and moving around, and then I was going to set it on fire. Yes, I know. Dumb idea. I could have killed the guy, but at the time and in my head, I was going to set his trailer on fire, and then as I was running off, he was going to wake up, run out, and stand there, mad, before having to move someplace else. But I was incredibly young and incredibly dumb, so things didn't quite go down like that at all. And it took a little while before I felt brave enough to siphon the gas that I needed to do the job. I didn't have any money, like at all, so I ended up stealing a can of paint thinner from our school's art supplies. Then one Friday night, after hanging with my buddies around the campfire like we always did, I lied to them and said that I was headed home when, really, I was headed to old Bob's place. Now, it took about an hour of walking around the lake to the other side, then once I was within maybe half a mile, I turned off my flashlight and traced the water's edge till I spotted a light coming from old Bob's trailer in the distance. I stuck to the plan and watched the place for maybe 40 to 45 minutes until the sound of a TV stopped and the dim light I could see went out. I gave it another minute or two, waiting until everything was silent and still, then I took that can of paint thinner from my backpack and started creeping towards Bob's trailer. My heart was pounding by the time I got within a few feet, and the fact that the trailer was still silent had me thinking that I'd crept up totally undetected. But then right as I'm about to pop the lid off my can of paint thinner, I suddenly hear this loud click to my right that I instantly recognized as a gun, before someone says, "What you got there, boy?" I froze, knowing it was old Bob and that he'd caught me red-handed trying to burn down his place. I didn't want to say what was in my hands because I figured once he knew what my plan was, he'd just blow my brains out without a second thought. And so I didn't say anything. Old Bob then told me to drop what I was carrying, and then when I dropped the can, I saw the beam of a little flashlight hover over it as Bob figured out what I was doing. He told me to turn around, because he wanted to see my face before he killed me. But again, my body didn't seem to want to respond. I was shaking by the time he rushed me and spun me around. But when he saw my face, he shoved me away from him so I fell over backwards and then just looked at me for a minute after lowering his gun. I was so scared that even though I wanted to beg him not to kill me, the words wouldn't come out. Then out of the blue, he said my name out loud to confirm it was me. I went from terrified to extremely confused and terrified. He knew my name, and he knew who my mom was too. And then after I confirmed who I was, he told me, "I wondered how long it'd be before you showed up." First words out of my mouth that whole time came out as, "How'd you know me?" And then after inviting me inside his trailer, old Bob promised to tell me everything I wanted to know. After we sat down in his trailer, he asked what my mom had told me about him. I guess I got a little braver because I told him all about how I hated him for killing my mom's friend. He asked to tell him how I thought it went down, and he just smiled as I told him my mom's version of events. He didn't interrupt at all, but when I was done, he told me, "Okay, kid, this is what really happened." My mom's friend was a very troubled dude growing up, and as much as people tried to help him, he only got worse as he aged into his teens. He was expelled from school for stealing panties out of the girls' locker room. He got in trouble with the cops for supposedly flashing a bunch of middle schoolers and only got charged with a lesser crime because he claimed he was peeing. And then in the months before he was murdered, he'd been seen talking to kids around town and said he was just playing with them when confronted by their parents. On the night he was murdered, it wasn't old Bob walking near the lake with a kid over his shoulder. It was my mom's friend, and in reality, the whole situation happened in almost complete reverse. Old Bob had been out hunting squirrels as he tended to do when he suddenly came across a bunch of drunk teenagers walking by the lake at night. It was a full moon, so he could see them clear as day walking through the shrubbery, and he follows them to make sure that they're not headed to his trailer for some reason. Old Bob stalking these kids along the edge of the lake, listening to them hooting and hollering and laughing, when he realizes one of them is carrying something over his shoulder, something that looks scarily like a kid with long glossy hair that shined in the moonlight. Old Bob closes the distance a little more and hears the group of kids planning to do something awful with what he realizes was an unconscious child. Then as soon as he heard that, Bob flicked on his flashlight and tells them to drop the child. The guy carrying the kid was my mom's old high school friend, but instead of dropping the kid and running, he pulls out a knife and is halfway to driving it into the kid's chest when old Bob puts a couple of .22s through his chest and drops him dead. Bob said he didn't get a good look at the kid who ran off, but at least one of them was almost certainly a girl. He then picks up the unconscious kid, walks her all the way into town, then drops her off at the old gas station where a clerk was on the night shift. The clerk called 911, but Bob didn't stick around. He just told the clerk that there was a body out near the lake and the cops should stop by old Robert Barnes' place because he's the one who did it. The cops stop by the very next morning and take Bob into custody, but his story checks out and the missing girl's parents were too relieved to have her home to do anything but thank him. And to them, Bob was a hero, but according to him, he sure didn't feel like one. When he got back from Vietnam, Bob promised himself he'd never hurt another human being as long as he lived, and that was half the reason he lived out in the sticks. If he'd been able to save that girl's life, it might have made it all worth it. But she was probably already dying from the tranq OD from the moment he first saw her, so all killing Mom's friend did was help a sick individual escape justice for his crimes. But what made him sick to his stomach, and made it feel like double the waste, was how the others got away with it. That was the reason he stayed away from town, because he couldn't stand being around the grown-ups' version of the little monsters who got away with ending that girl's life. He didn't know exactly who they were, but he figured there was a pretty good chance my mom was one of them. Bob said he didn't care if I believed him or not. He just wanted me to do him one favor. Go home, tell my mom what he just told me, then look her dead in the eye after asking if it's all true or not. Well, I did exactly that, and while it's best not to describe blow for blow how that little exchange went down, let's just say our relationship has never recovered, and she's the reason I haven't been back to Wyoming in almost 20 years now. Back in 2002, my boyfriend and I were driving from Chicago to this little town in South Dakota called Vermillion, where his parents lived. Around noon, we'd been cruising through Iowa cornfields for hours on end, when suddenly the corn just sort of stopped. It was like coming out of a forest into an open field, but instead of seeing nothing but green grass, all we could see was ash and charcoal. There had obviously been some kind of fire, and while my boyfriend said it's normal for farmers to sometimes burn their fields to prepare them for a new cycle or whatever, it still looked creepy as hell. We went from being able to see just a few feet on either side of the highway to being able to see for miles upon miles around us. We went from being able to see just a few feet on either side of the highway to being able to see for miles upon miles around us. And that's how it was so easy to spot the man and the little boy that I saw walking hand in hand through a burned-out cornfield. I could only see them at a distance at first, but The difference inside was plain to see, and boy did it look wholesome. It looked like some old-timer taking his grandson out for a walk to show him the burned-out fields. And then as I watched them from a distance, I saw that they were headed toward what looked like an old well. I didn't mention it to my boyfriend at all. We were enjoying a comfortable conversation hiatus while listening to a little music, so I just watched the Hallmark card scene zoom in as we got closer in almost silence. And by the time the pair of them reached the well, I could see both of them in almost perfect detail. I could see the old-timer was wearing dungarees and had a little dark, thinning hair on the top of his head, and I could see the little boy's blue shirt and white sneakers and how he had this almost white blonde curly hair too. And then as we drove right past them, I also saw it clear as day when the old man picked up the little boy and then tossed him down the well. I remember yelling out, "Oh my God," at the top of my lungs in the seconds after I saw it. Then as my boyfriend was panicking, asking me what the hell was going on, I was frantically searching through my bag looking for my cell phone. I briefly thought about asking him to stop the car, but this image flashed in my head of us lying dead in that field, covered in gunshot wounds, so I just told him to keep on driving, and that a kid had just been thrown down a well. Now he says, "What? What the hell are you talking about?" Because he'd been zoned out with his eyes glued to the road and hadn't seen a thing. But once I explained in a little more crucial detail, he asked if I was 100% sure that I wasn't mistaken, and he understood why I was so freaked out. I eventually managed to find my cell phone, but when I pulled it out and unlocked it, I saw I had exactly 0 bars. So I did the next best thing and grabbed our map so I could find out where the nearest town was. I was relieved to see that there was just one a few miles down the road, and I told my boyfriend to put his foot down so we could get there and call 911. And when we rolled into town, the first place we saw was this little diner at the side of the highway called Albert Kitchen. And we pulled into the parking lot and I almost fell rushing from my car to the front doors. And then once I was inside, everyone's heads spun around as I ran up to the counter and asked to use their phone. The lady behind the counter said sure, and then I dialed 911 when she put the phone up to the counter and asked to talk to the police. As I described what happened to the dispatcher, everyone in the diner was listening in, and they gasped when I said how I saw a kid get thrown down a well. The dispatcher said to wait where I was so the sheriff could send a deputy over, and then after I thanked her, I hung up. I was still shaking with adrenaline by the time I placed the handset back in its cradle on that phone, and when I turned around, every single person in the diner was just staring at me. The lady behind the counter brought me a glass of ice water to help me calm down. Then as me and my boyfriend were waiting for the cops to show up, a man got up from his table and began to approach us. He introduced himself and then started asking about the burned-out fields we'd seen. And then when I went over what we'd seen and how every field for miles was all blackened and charred, he turned around to one of the other diners and asked if they were some guy's fields. Art Landry is the name I remember him saying. He then asked me to describe the man I'd seen, and then everyone seemed to agree that it was Art Landry that I'd seen and that his grandkids had been staying with him that week because their parents were out of town. Everyone seemed shocked, but also really confused. They obviously knew this Landry guy pretty well, so to hear that he'd done something so terrible, they just couldn't believe what they were hearing. They asked me a couple of times if I was sure, and then when I said that I'd never been so sure of anything in my entire life, there was almost this ripple of "oh my God" and "oh dear Lord" all around the room. Now, I'm not exactly sure how long went by before a deputy actually showed up to talk to us, and when they did, we went out to our car so we could talk in detail away from the people inside the diner. Now, I repeated the whole thing again and got that same sort of "are you sure" reaction from the deputy, like what I'd said was just almost verging on impossible or ridiculous. And then right as he's asking me all these questions, another cop car rolls into the parking lot, and out steps the county sheriff who's driven all the way over from their headquarters to talk to us. The deputy saved me from repeating my story for pretty much the fourth time by explaining exactly what I'd seen to the sheriff. And he too did the whole, "Huh? Really?" thing, and then walked off to talk on his radio for a couple of minutes before returning to where we were standing. He told us someone over at HQ had called Mr. Landry to ask him about what I'd seen. Now, Art didn't know what I was talking about, and said while he did have his grandson staying with him that week, that they hadn't been anywhere near those burned-out cornfields. Now, by then, I was practically begging the sheriff to drive us back down the highway so I could show him exactly the well that I've been talking about. He said he couldn't just walk up on somebody's land like that without a warrant, and that he'd have to speak with Mr. Landry personally before anything like that happened. I tried to keep my cool. I knew the longer we talked, the less chance that kid had of surviving that fall, not to mention whatever was down there at the bottom of the well. If it was water, he might drown. If it was dry, then we need to get him out ASAP before he died. I tried to convey all of that as best I could, but the more animated I got, the more the sheriff and his deputies started to look at me like I was crazy. I had to literally beg the sheriff before he told his deputy to drive out to the old well on that farm to check it out. But when he did, I was so genuinely thankful that I almost burst into tears. The whole time we were waiting, my boyfriend was like, "It's going to be okay. You'll see. Everything's going to be fine." The sheriff was almost half sitting in his car talking on his radio. Then all of a sudden, he got up and walked over to us, calling out that he'd got some good news. Firstly, the well on that farm was empty, and secondly, Mr. Landry was headed down to the diner with his grandson, so I could see for myself that everything was fine. Now, I was kind of speechless for a second because I was certain, and I still am, of what I saw out there. The sheriff then took the opportunity to explain how, thankfully, I just must have been mistaken. Who I saw out there, they were probably just picking their kid up to show them the bottom, and any dropping or falling that I saw was a kind of maybe optical illusion given from how fast we were driving through the smoke. And the only thing that I could think to ask when word finally came back to me was like, how could the deputy be so sure the well was empty? Was he sure that there wasn't a kid down there, underwater maybe, or just out of reach of his flashlight? I knew what I saw. There was a kid's life at stake, and I wasn't about to just take someone else's word for it, especially when they were throwing around phrases like optical illusion or trick of the light, which was starting to sound more and more suspicious to me the more they cropped that up. And I get that people have that small-town mentality of wanting to defend their own, but the way they didn't even seem to give a crap about this kid started to turn from alarming to kind of disturbing. And as I'm trying to keep my cool and stay polite as I'm explaining to the sheriff that I know what I saw, the deputy returns from checking the well. But following behind is this beat-up old truck, and after it comes to a stop, out steps this big old guy in dungarees with dark, thinning hair. And the first thing he said was something like, "Now who's this saying I didn't drop my damn grandson down a well?" He sounded mad, and the sheriff walked over now saying, "Hey, now just hold on, Art. She's just trying to help." Now this man named Art then walked around to the passenger side of his truck, opened up the door, and then helped a young boy out of the seat. He then led him around to us to see, and then told me that was the boy he'd supposedly thrown down the well in this very aggressive, accusatory way. Now my boyfriend said quietly, "See, I told you everything'd be fine." Like in a very comforting kind of way, but things were not fine, because the kid that I'd seen had blonde, curly hair, and the kid in front of us had dark hair that was closely cut. Now I started getting more and more frantic as I explained how it wasn't the same kid, and the deputy tried telling me maybe it was the sun catching his hair that made it look like it was blonde. Now having them trying to make me feel like I was crazy made me want to scream, but I knew that was the last thing that had helped my case. So instead, I tried asking if there was anyone else I could talk to because I didn't feel like they were being very helpful. And then while me and the deputy were talking, the sheriff asked my boyfriend if they could talk in private. A few minutes later, my boyfriend comes back saying we need to leave. The sheriff had basically asked if I was crazy or not, when my boyfriend said no, He told me to get out of town before I was arrested on charges of public disturbance. They couldn't have people just rolling into town, throwing around accusations and dirtying a good man's name. So unless we had any other official business to attend to, we were to leave immediately or face arrest. Now by that point, I actually wanted to leave. I had this horrible, creeping feeling that something dark was going on in that small town. But whatever it was, neither of us were getting to the bottom of it while in the parking lot of that damn diner. I faked an apology to that farmer and his grandson, whoever the poor kid was. And then the second we were back on the road and I had some reception, I called the Iowa State Patrol to report the whole thing. I told them that I thought something messed up was going on over in that town, specifically on the farm of one Art Landry, but they got back to me saying that there was nothing to it. I then went through the whole complaints process, saying that I didn't think my report was being handled properly, but again they got back to me saying they'd done everything they could, but there was still nothing to report. But I know what I saw. I'd never had any kind of hallucinations before or since. I don't need glasses, and no, I'm not crazy. My dad used to work for the Foreign Office, and he met my mom while working in Peru. My mom's heritage is really important to her, so things like Peruvian food and music were a big part of my childhood growing up. We only visited once when I was a kid, too, so in my late 20s, I decided that I'd fly over to visit relatives and explore my mother country a wee bit. I was driving on this little back road in the middle of nowhere, trying to find the little town my relatives lived in, when I suddenly saw these flashing lights in my rear view. The Peruvian police are pulling me over for some reason, so not wanting to cause trouble, I pulled over fast and got ready to use my very rusty Spanish. But instead of getting out of his car and walking over all slowly with his shades on like the Yanks do in the movies, this police officer takes a defensive stance behind his open car door and then starts hailing me over his loudspeaker, telling me to stick my hands out of my window. Immediately, I'm crapping myself, because I've barely seen a gun in real life before, let alone had one pointed in my direction. And then as I'm shouting at this policeman that I'm unarmed and terrified, he's acting like I'm some hardened criminal, telling me to shut my mouth as he slowly approaches my window. He's got his gun right in my face as he's trying to put cuffs on me one-handed, to the point that one flip of his trigger finger and my brains were going to be decorating the passenger seat. And then as he's doing that, even more police cars start turning up before they literally drag me out of the car and off to jail. Being in that jail cell was probably the single lowest point of my entire life. The police have been throwing around words like murderer, violator, and hurting children. And one even gasped and said, "That's him," as I was led through the station. I was having these daylight waking nightmares about being locked in a foreign country for something I didn't do, which were made all the worse by the occasional policeman coming to gawp at me through the bars of my cell. I kept trying to tell them that I was British and that I was only there on holiday, but they responded by asking if I thought they were stupid and to shut my mouth before they shut it for me. Terrible stuff like that. And this goes on for a couple of hours, and I think my life is just over. And then out of the blue, someone unlocks my cell and tells me that there's been a mistake, and I'm suddenly free to go. It was a very surreal experience walking out of that police station. I was shaking like a chihuahua, but the police were a mix of either laughing at the mix-up or apologizing on a scale that did not cover what I'd been through. They acted like they'd ticketed the wrong car, not dragged me into the station at gunpoint, but regardless, I was just glad to be on my way. I was relieved, but I was furious too. I just couldn't show it lest they find a reason to lock me up again. But before I left, they showed me a picture of the man they'd confused me with. He was a violent, wanted criminal, a truly dangerous individual, and looking at his picture was like staring almost into a mirror. Easily the most terrifying experience of my life, and when I asked my relatives if I was entitled to any kind of compensation, they laughed before saying, "No chance." Now, I had an amazing time and I don't regret going, but I also haven't been back to Peru since, and next time, I'm getting my family to pick me up from the bloody airport. The worst day of my life was a Sunday, and it happened in a little town called Windsor, out on the Carolina coast. Now back then, Windsor was home to less than 2,000 people and was your average backwoods North Carolina town. We had a grocery store, a gas station, a Bojangles, and the peanut factory. And then aside from a few churches and chapels that surrounded the town, that was pretty much it. It was quiet and neighborly. Murder wasn't a word that you heard spoken around Windsor, and you only ever heard it on the radio or on television. But then came that night in 1993, when all that evil stepped out of the TV and took a walk around town. It was the evening of June 6th, and I was down at the Bertie County Sheriff's Office about a mile south of town. The Bertie County Jail is down there too, and after collecting some paperwork from one of the deputies over there, I was sitting at my desk just quietly filling it out when we suddenly heard dispatch over our radios. It was the quietest day of the week, so I don't think anyone was expecting anything more than a civil dispute or a minor accident. So when we heard the codes for a man with a gun or multiple deaths, there was this split second where I was convinced that there had been some kind of mistake. But when I saw my fellow deputies running out of the office and towards their cars, I knew that there was no mistake. It was real. I followed the other deputies out into the parking lot, jumped into my cruiser, and then we sped off in a rough convoy towards the grocery store on the north side of town. Now, this grocery store is called B-Low, as in a play on the words be low, as in the prices here be low, and it rivaled the local churches in terms of places folks could congregate and converse. And so, knowing the three deceased were most likely people I knew, maybe even friends of mine, that was already a tough pill to swallow during that rush towards the store. And when we arrived, the place was all closed and locked up since they closed early on Sundays, and we still had next to no idea what to expect. The 911 call that had come into dispatch was from a wounded survivor of whatever had happened, and with them being in so much pain, they couldn't go into too much detail. We only knew that there were bodies, a man with a gun, and survivors who desperately needed our help. The B-Low had these glass panel windows all the way along the front, so on the approach, you could see this long trail of blood going from the front to the back of the store. After we busted in, we found all that blood belonged to a member of B-Low's cleaning crew who'd crawled all the way from the back of the store with gunshot wounds so he could use the phone. Me and the other deputies spread out once we got inside, clearing the place from aisle to aisle to make sure no one was waiting to ambush us, and then once we got to the back of the store, we found 5 more people. 3 of them were dead, and another was badly wounded with stab wounds. But for some reason, the killer had left the 5th person, a member of the cleaning crew, completely unharmed. And there was no helping most of those that had been shot, but we did what we could for the survivors, and thankfully both of them made it through. But as EMS were working on getting the wounded airlifted to the hospital, we got to hear the whole story of what had happened from that one other member of the cleaning crew who got to walk away covered in blood, but without a scratch. And it was every bit as bad as we feared it was. Every Sunday, a cleaning crew used to stop by the B-Low to wax the floors and get them all shiny again for the next week. So come closing time at 6 p.m., and once his customers were gone, the store's manager let the crew inside and then locks the doors behind him. The crew starts shifting mats and getting their buffers ready when the last remaining store clerk sees a person she doesn't recognize step out from one of the aisles. She thinks it's a customer who failed to notice the store closing, but when she walks up to the guy and informs him it's after closing, he points a gun in her face. The cleaning crew are right at the front of the store at this point, and the guy moves on the clerk so quietly that they don't even notice what's going on. So as the gunman's forcing the clerk into the back office, they're completely none the wiser. And once he's in the office, the gunman orders the manager to hand over all the on-site cash. He hit at the exact right time, too, right at the end of the week, and we know that he made it out of there with a few $1,000s in cash along with a bunch of money orders totaling $3,000. But then, instead of just leaving after getting his hands on the cash, the gunman orders the manager and clerk back onto the shop floor and then rounds up the cleaning crew too. I didn't see exactly what the victims were bound with, but I later heard it was dog leashes the gunman grabbed from one of the aisles. And then once he got all 6 of them at the back of the store, he ordered them to tie each other up at gunpoint. He tied the last person up himself, and our survivor was telling us how, once everyone was tied up, he thought that the ordeal was over. The guy had his money, he had everyone tied up so they couldn't call the cops right away, and he had no reason at all to do what he did next. But he went ahead and did it anyway, and this is where things started getting really, really messed up. The gunman starts stacking people up in their twos, ordering them to lie on top of each other, and then before anyone can figure out why, he says, "God forgive me for what I'm about to do," and then starts shooting into the stacks. He only got a couple of shots off before either his gun jammed or he ran out of ammunition, and then when he ran off, our survivor said that he thought it was over for a second time. But then seconds later, the gunman comes running back with a knife he'd grabbed from someplace, and he starts asking the survivor if they're going to tell the cops about him. Obviously, the survivor says no, and so does the man stacked on top of him, who we later found out was the survivor's own brother. But as they're trying to convince the guy they won't tell us cops about him, he flips out and starts stabbing the brother on top with the knife he'd found. He cut the guy's throat from ear to ear and then kept on stabbing him in the back till the knife blade broke off inside of him. Our survivor claims he then asked him for a second time if he'd identify him to the cops if given the chance, and then when he says no again, the gunman walks out with the money and leaves the last man alive. Our survivor said he was convinced that the guy would come back, just like he did before when he went to grab a knife. He also had his dead brother on top of him, so I don't think he could have moved even if he wanted to. And then the surviving member of the cleaning crew, thinking that the other man was dead, manages to free himself from the dog leash before he crawls towards the front of the store, which was where we found him, with the phone still in his hand. When it came to the investigation that followed, I don't remember ever being so invested in a case before. One of the poor folks killed was a relative of the county sheriff, so he made it a personal mission of his to bring the guy in. But right from the get-go, things started to go wrong. First off, the Below security camera system wasn't working at the time of the attack. They had a repairman scheduled for that coming week, and while the timing of that still haunts me, it obviously meant that we had no security camera images of our suspect. Secondly, all 3 of our survivors gave us a matching description of the guy, a very distinct one too. He supposedly had a crooked nose and hazel eyes, but the sketches we circulated didn't amount to any sightings of him, no solid ones anyways. All we had were reports of a white sedan with Maryland tags speeding out of town on the 17 not after the murders, though. But after the car was tracked down, its owner was cleared of any involvement. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think the most frustrating part was how the investigation ended up fixated on this one detail that I'm not even sure was true. At one point, one of the victims asked the killer, "Why are you doing this?" And while she was referring to them being stacked on top of one another, the guy must have thought that she was asking him a more general question as in, "Why are you robbing us?" He said something about being a former cop and one who was recently fired from his job. But although it was clear early on that he couldn't have been a cop since there was no match on his fingerprints and the lead investigators seemed convinced he was either former military or former law enforcement, that completely contradicted what people like myself came to think, which involved him being a fugitive who killed because he didn't want any witnesses. But by the time the investigation started to seriously consider that possibility, the killer could have easily escaped the country using the thousands of dollars he stole. And that's my best guess as to why he wasn't caught anyway. And afterwards, people who worked in law enforcement talked about what happened like it was a tornado or something. They made it sound like this terrible, almost random event that no one could have stopped. but I still felt useless. The worst thing to happen in Windsor for maybe 200 years, and I'd been sitting on my ass writing our paperwork while some sick bastard was stacking bodies and blowing their brains out 2 at a time. But what I still can't figure is, why did he let the last victim live? Our survivor told us that the killer told him straight up, "I'm gonna let you live." But that makes my fugitive theory seem a little shaky. Part of me thinks he just got tired of killing and he couldn't face stabbing a second person to death after killing what he thought was 4 other people. But then, there's this other part of me, one that thinks that he left one alive so he could tell everyone what happened, because he wanted everyone to know what he did and how he did it, so he could maybe read about it in the papers afterwards. But I try not to entertain that side of me, because when I do, it makes the pain of not catching that guy hurt even worse. I grew up in a place called Bart Township in rural Pennsylvania. Now, Bart is about as rural as it gets, especially around nickel mines where I grew up, which is home to a bunch of old order Amish. And if you're thinking of the Amish who practice Rumspringa or use flip phones because they're quote-unquote essential technology, this is not the old order. They're so hardcore they still refer to anyone who isn't Amish as English, and that was my childhood, living like we were aliens in our own country. But I didn't know any better, so I was happy, right up until October 2nd of 2006. Now, like most kids my age, I dropped out of school after 8th grade to help my dad on the farm, and so that morning, we were working together while my little brother was at school. Everything was going as normal, just another day on the farm, when all of a sudden my dad says, "Is that your brother?" I looked up to see this little speck in the distance, running down the tracks towards our farmhouse, and I knew it was him. Dad then says, "What the hell's he doing out of school?" Because it was only 11 in the morning. And then I followed him as he marched off towards the house to find out what was going on. We got to the house to find my little brother in tears and my mom comforting him. Dad still thought that he'd just run away from school, so he was still kind of angry, or sort of getting ready to be angry. But when my little brother finally got his words out and told us why he'd run home from school, I remember it was almost like time stood still for a few seconds. He told us there was a man in our classroom, and he had a gun. If you can believe it, this wasn't even the scariest part, because as my dad is freaking out and rushing to grab his own gun, my little brother says something about the guy having chains and hooks too. Well, that was it. The red mist descended over Dad, and he ran off in the direction of the old schoolhouse while telling me to stay put and watch my mom and brother. We had to wait hours before Dad came back with the news of what had happened, and when he did, this is what he told us. Around 10:30 that morning, not long after the kids came back from recess, a pickup truck parked in front of the old schoolhouse. A man got out, walked inside, and then asked the kid's teacher if she'd found a clevis pin out in the road. Now, a clevis pin is kind of like a bolt, something used to fasten 2 things together. They're commonly used in farming, so almost everyone around those mines knows what one is. And since the kid's teacher hadn't spotted one that morning, she apologized for not being able to help, but wished the guy luck in finding his missing pin. The guy acted kind of weird. He didn't make any eye contact, and he mumbled some sort of reply before walking back to his truck. But then a minute later, he walks back into the schoolhouse with a pistol and tells everyone they either do as he says or they're going to die. Now, thinking it's just a robbery of some kind, the kid's teacher tells the class to do as the guy says. But then instead of stealing the school's petty cash box and driving off, the guy orders all the young boys present, including my brother, to help him unload items from his truck before carrying them into the classroom. They carried in a whole bunch of tools, a shotgun, and a stun gun, but also a big pile of lumber, along with some wires, chains, and what we found out later was a bunch of metal eye hooks. The guy wanted to force the kids to watch what he was going to do to them, but as he's supervising the unloading of his truck, the kid's teacher made a run for it and managed to get to a nearby farmer to call 911. The guy noticed that the teacher got away, so he ordered one of the boys to go bring them back, and then went about barricading the schoolhouse doors using the lumber and nails the boys had carried inside. When he finished, the guy allowed 3 parents, including a pregnant lady I heard, and all the boys in the class to leave. Then after that, he makes all the girls line up against the chalkboard like he was some sort of one-man firing squad. The first cop car arrived at the schoolhouse just minutes after that farmer's 911 call. Knowing what was going on, the cop used his loudspeaker to plead with the armed man to throw down his weapons and allow the girls to leave. Around this same time, the man calls 911 personally and tells the dispatcher that if the cops make a move on him, he'd execute the girls. He was saying all that right there in front of them, so those poor girls knew what was about to happen and were also begging him not to hurt them. 2 of the girls even asked to be shot first, possibly in the hopes that it would spare the lives of the other kids lined up next to them. But the man told them to be quiet and kept on talking to the cops. Dad said that by 11 a.m., there was a whole crowd gathered around the schoolhouse's perimeter and that a bunch of ambulances were there too, waiting to treat the wounded. They all heard when the shooting started, and Dad said the sound that rose up from the crowd was like nothing he'd ever heard before. Just this terrible sound of collective mourning as each gunshot meant a lost life and broken hearts that would never fully heal. As the gunshots start popping off, all the cops start rushing the schoolhouse, hoping to put a stop to the massacre. But the man realized what was happening and started shooting at the cops out of a window. They returned fire, being careful to only target the window that they were being shot at from. The man stopped firing and they figured that he was either hit or reloading. But when they burst into the schoolhouse, they found him dead on the floor, with a single self-inflicted gunshot to the head. We later found out that just before the shooting started, the man tried to call his wife to say goodbye. And I don't think she picked up the phone, but he must have left a message or something because when she got home from wherever she was, the first thing that she saw was a note on the table describing what her husband had planned that day. She had also called 911, hoping to stop what was planned before it ever started, but by then, it was way too late and her husband was only minutes away from murdering a whole bunch of innocent children. And all the wounded girls were taken to the hospital, but of the 10 kids shot that morning, only 4 survived. A couple were pronounced dead at the scene, and I heard one little girl passed away in the arms of a state trooper as he tried to comfort her. They were all between just 6 and 13 years old. For some reason, in the middle of this massacre, the guy decided to switch from shooting them with a pistol to shooting them with a shotgun. He still had ammunition in his pistol too, so a lot of people think he switched weapons to inflict more damage and make the scene even more gruesome than it already was. No one could understand why someone would do that. I mean, killing them is one thing, but deliberately making it as messy as possible is just... It seemed like the kind of evil I'd never be able to truly understand. But then, after we found out who did it, or more importantly why he did it, it all started to make sense in this sort of sick way. First off, finding out who killed all those kids was a major shocker, because pretty much everyone in the nickel mines area and the surrounding areas knew who the guy was. His name was Charlie Roberts, and he lived down in Georgetown, and he was the milk tank driver who visited a bunch of local farms, sometimes multiple times a week too. He actually knew the families of some of the kids he killed, and he had a wife and 3 kids of his own at the time of the massacre. The cops talked to his coworkers about him, and they said while Charlie had a history of depression and such, he seemed to perk up in the days before the massacre. But this is most probably because he decided he was going to kill a bunch of people, and that made him feel better about himself. The cops also thought he was inspired by a similar kind of hostage situation which had happened in Colorado the same week as this one. Obviously, there was no getting a solid answer on that one because he was now dead. But he laid out almost exactly what drove him to kill those kids in the notes he left, and the message he left on his wife's voicemail that morning. It turned out Charlie Roberts was hurting children in many ways, and had abused 2 female relations of his back when he was 12. He told his wife that he was daydreaming about doing it again, and that also explains the lubrication the cops found at the scene. But Charlie also explained that the death of his daughter was the reason he wanted to kill. He and his wife lost their little girl during childbirth about 10 years earlier, and he wrote in one of his notes that he was filled with hate towards himself and God because of her death. His 2 female relations said that the whole abuse thing was just made up, but I can see them saying that purely because they wanted their privacy and all of that. Either way, people started saying that Charlie wasn't that, and that he was just crazy, because he didn't actually touch those girls at the schoolhouse at all. He just killed them in cold blood before taking the coward's way out. And over the week or so that followed, the schoolhouse was knocked down and flattened so it couldn't remind anyone of what had happened. And while the reaction of the local Amish made me proud in a lot of ways, it was the beginning of me realizing that I'm not like them, and that I couldn't stay. So for example, one of the first things folks did was reach out to Charlie's dad, who, as you can imagine, was absolutely distraught after learning about what his son went and did. They told him they forgave his son for what he'd done, and a bunch of folks even went to Charlie's funeral as a show of support for his heartbroken family. I thought all that was pretty cool because it obviously wasn't Charlie's parents' fault that their son went crazy, but the thing that still doesn't sit right with me was how people chose to forgive Charlie too. Amish people were taught not to hold grudges, but I just couldn't find it in myself to forgive a man who had brought lubrication into a schoolhouse full of girls in single-digit ages, and then end them. There was almost this attitude of like, if you can forgive the guy, it makes you a better Christian. So when it came to the concept of prevention, as in stopping something like that from ever happening again, people said things like, it's in the hands of God now. It's down to the Almighty alone to protect us. I remember another person saying how they were happy Charlie Roberts had taken his own life because it meant he'd already been judged by God by the time we were laying those girls to rest. If he repented before God, he'd be forgiven all of his sins. But the more I thought about that, the more I felt like I didn't belong among the old order. And now, it's been almost 10 years since I left Nickel Mines behind me. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the Bigfoot creature that Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin filmed on October 20th, 1967 was real. It was half man and half gorilla. Thousands of years ago, men went to Africa and other places and made love with female gorillas and orangutans. Some of the Bigfoot creatures have dark hair like the gorilla, and some of them have reddish hair like the orangutan. Some of the men that went to Africa and other places were tall, and some of the Bigfoot creatures were tall. Have you ever seen an 8-foot tall gorilla or orangutan? Neither have I. When scientists found the bones, they thought we evolved from primates. But it wasn't a natural evolution. It was a man-made evolution. Bigfoot can't save the earth, but we can. Stop overpopulating.